At this time, I would like to turn it over to Vijay to present our Q2 research results. Vijay?
Thank you, Zeke. Michelle and Divya, welcome to the panel. We'll get to the panel in a few minutes. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Quick reminder, we are recording this webinar, so we want to make sure that everybody is comfortable with that. So let's dive into the research data. So just to set the level here, CTrio started researching the market for CCPA compliance about a year ago. We started looking at companies to understand what they're doing with regard to CCPA compliance and what they say, whether they are required to comply with CCPA, and if the companies say if they're required to comply with CCPA, what they're doing with it. And in our research, we identified several companies and we started bucketizing them into 3 buckets predominantly. One is if a company says they need to comply with CCPA and they implemented a commercial solution to automate the whole process, we put them as compliant automation bucket. The second bucket was if the company said they need to comply with CCPA, but they provided a manual process such as an email, XYZ at privacy@ctrio.com, or a 1-800 number or a telephone number or a web form, we put that company in the somewhat compliant manual bucket. The third bucket is a company that says they need to comply with CCPA, but they do not provide a mechanism for the consumer to exercise their data privacy rights. They don't even provide an email, no telephone number, nothing, right? They don't even talk about how a consumer can exercise their privacy rights. So that kind of a company is put under the non-compliant bucket, right? So as of the end of Q2 2022, we have looked at about 8,270 companies. We added about 1,525 companies in Q2 alone. And what the data shows us is that about 9% of the companies are using commercial solutions, about 41% of the companies are using manual processes, and about 50% of the companies are in the non-compliant bucket, right? When you look at the top 3 states and compared to Q1, they remain the same, right? California, New York, and Texas being the top 3 states overall. About 32% of the companies overall in the 8,200 companies are coming from these, are domiciled in these states. If you look at the verticals, similarly, the top 3 verticals remain the same compared to last quarter. And the percentage of the companies that are coming from these verticals also remain same. About 55% of the companies are falling in these top three verticals, that's business services, retail, and financial services. And if you break that down into B2B versus B2C, compared to Q1 and Q2, on the B2C side, right now we have about 4,000 odd companies in the B2C bucket, the B2C cohort. And of that, we are seeing about 10% of the B2C companies are using compliance automation solutions, about 43% are using manual processes, and about 47% are non-compliant bucket. On the B2B side, we have almost 3,800 companies, a little over 3,800 companies in the overall pool. And of that, about 8% are using compliance automation solutions, about 40% are using manual processes, and 52% are using non-compliant in the non-compliant bucket. So the big takeaway here is that on the B2B side, even though they say they need to comply with CCPA, there is a higher percentage of those B2B companies which are in the non-compliant bucket that are doing nothing, right? So that's an interesting finding here. Yep. And if you drill deeper into the details of this thing, again, give me 1 minute. If you try to break it down by the size of the companies, and the first bucket is that 100 employees to 1,000 employee bucket, about 8% of the companies in that cohort are using automation solutions versus 40% odd in the manual processes and about 51% in the non-compliant bucket, right? So that has been consistent. What we are seeing, the percentages here are consistent. They might be off by a percentage or half a percentage point for the last 3 reports that we have published. This is the 3rd report we are publishing in this area. And as we folks might have read on our website, we are going to be publishing this data on a quarterly basis. We are going to be adding additional companies to the total pool on a quarterly basis. Now, if you look at the 1,000+ employee companies, again, the percentage of companies using automation solutions is a little higher than the smaller companies, for 10%. And the companies in the manual versus non-compliant buckets are also, again, consistent with what we have seen in the prior quarters. Not much of a change. Now, if you go into the GDPR data, in Q2 of the 1,525 companies, about 22% of those companies said they need to comply with GDPR in addition to CCPA also. Of those 22% companies, which are about 337 companies, 6% are using automation solutions and 94% are using manual processes. And breaking that into states and verticals, top 3 states actually compared to Q1, there was a change. Top 2 states, California and New York, remained the same. If you guys remember in Q1, when we looked at GDPR data, there was a first quarter we looked at the GDPR data. Massachusetts was actually number 3. Now Florida has taken their spot and they've become the number 3 state in the top 3 states. And about 42% of the overall companies in the GDPR bucket are coming from these 3 states. In addition to the top 3 verticals, they remain the same as in Q1. About 65% of the companies come from business services, hospitality, and retail verticals. And this can be explained because mostly these are consumer-facing companies, and they tend to be more eager to comply with GDPR. If you break that down by B2B versus B2C compared to Q1 and Q2, right now in B2C, we have 180 companies in the GDPR cohort that are in the B2C cohort. Of that, about 8% of the companies are using automation solutions and 92% are using manual processes. That is a pretty significant difference compared to B2B. In the B2B, only 4% of the companies are using automation solutions versus B2C, which is about 8%. The rest of the companies are using manual processes. Okay. So in Q2, we started looking at some trends and we said, now that we have sufficient data, let's see if we are seeing any trends in terms of movement from one cohort to other cohort. That is your somewhat compliant cohort. Are they moving to automation? Similarly, are the companies in the non-compliant bucket, are they moving to either automation or manual processes? And the goal here was for us to identify and see if we can see any maturity curve that we saw in the other compliance areas, right? So what we have learned in my experience of 20 years in compliance market is businesses tend to follow a maturity curve. They don't just go and comply. They try to do minimal at the beginning, and then over time, as the compliance expenses move, the time and the expense go up, they try to move up the maturity curve to implement more stringent compliance processes in place. So in the first bucket of the cohort that we looked at, which is somewhat compliant manual bucket, we randomly selected 200 companies from the Q1 cohort or Q1 bucket. And we looked at and said, what percentage of these companies are moving to automation or moving down, right? What we learned is about 3.5% of these companies are moving to automation solutions, which is a good thing to see, positive thing to see. Within this, we also now started breaking that down into B2B versus B2C. And what we learned is that B2B companies are more eager to implement commercial solutions versus B2C, 5% versus 1%, right? And we also broke this down by the revenue range. Again, here, larger companies, $100+ million companies, are more eager to implement automation solutions versus smaller companies. Then we looked at the non-compliant bucket, and the non-compliant bucket can technically fall into 2 as they move up the maturity curve. Either they can go straight from non-compliant to implementing an automation solution, or they move to the next stage, which is somewhat compliant solution, a compliant process, where they include an email or a telephone number for the consumer to exercise their data privacy rights. Interestingly, what we found is that none of the non-compliant companies were actually moving to automation directly. Pretty much all of them, the companies that made progress in the maturity curve, they were moving to the manual process. About 6% of them were moving to manual process. Again, we broke this down into B2B versus B2C. B2B companies here were more eager to comply again with the moving up the maturity curve compared to B2C companies. And interestingly, in this particular bucket, the smaller companies were more eager to move up the maturity curve versus the larger companies. So, which is an interesting trend here. Zeke, would you like to run a poll, please?
Yep, we just launched. If everyone could just take a moment to fill out this poll that we're asking around data protection impacts assessments. What's on the screen there, Vijay?
Yep. So the results tell us that 63% of the respondents said they're doing the DPA assessment more than once a year, and 25% are doing once a year, and about 13% are not doing it at all. And 75% are using manual processes, spreadsheets, and 13% are using commercial solutions, and the same 13% that are not doing any DPA, of course, they're not doing anything. They're not using any tools. Quick introduction to CTrio, since we have all of you, we'll spend a couple of minutes. CTrio is now in the market with a data privacy compliance management solution, which is an automation solution. Our focus is helping companies automate data privacy rights management today, but end of next month, we'll be introducing DPA and PIA and data mapping modules within our product. It's an all-in-one solution with automated data discovery as well as built-in workflows. I think this is all something that all of you know. Complying with the data privacy rights compliance is an expensive process, time-consuming process, and that's where the automation can help companies in a meaningful way. And the way you respond to DSAR requests, any company that is serious about complying with this requirement should follow these 7 steps. It's a well documented steps. It includes how do you provide an easy mechanism for consumer to submit the data request, how do you validate the identity, how do you triage and orchestrate the response process, how do you search and identify all data that belongs to the requester, review and approve the data before it is shared with the consumer so that you can avoid or minimize the data breach, potential data breach, and then securely respond to the data requests and share the information with the consumer or the requester in a secure manner, and also maintain a detailed audit log so that when the auditor comes knocking on the door, you can demonstrate very clearly that you have a well-defined process to comply with these requirements. At CTrio, we have a cloud-based SaaS solution. At the core of our platform is this data discovery and correlation of the PI data with the subject data identity. We have 2 modules built on top of that. One is a consumer-facing portal that allows the consumers to easily and quickly, literally in 2 clicks, submit the data requests, also securely download their information. And we have the administrative console that allows the security and privacy professionals to collaborate and respond to data requests. Our goal at the end of the day is provide the SLAs, allow companies and business to respond to these data requests, not in 30 days, but in a few minutes, a few hours, as well as reduce the cost of responding to the data requests in a meaningful way by a factor of almost 80+%.